Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you get a keyboard with that?
No.
You had this conversation yesterday, you know that? Like while I was here.
She did.
Yeah.
Did you just say yes or no? It doesn't matter. Just moves on then.
Do you just not even...
No, I do. I listen to you when you... But not.
Did I ask him, did he get a keyboard?
Yes, we had a long conversation. 500.
I wouldn't say it was a long conversation now. That's an exaggeration.
Do you think I need to go to one of those media house seminars for your sort of
What?
your brain?
No.
Yeah. I don't know what it.
Less people closely examine your brain, the better.
No. Okay, so you've
Anyway.
great. You're great on the things that interest
It's
you.
Friday.
You're interested. Yes, exactly.
You know the way I used to kind of
You zone
out on a Friday afternoon?
Exactly.
Do you remember that? That's
I
what's
do.
happening to me.
It's ADHD hour.
Before I do,
Yeah.
we're going to talk about Padraig Nally and John Frog Ward. We're going to remind ourselves of this story because, of course, today in the news is the fact that a man by the name of Padraig Nally, 81, has passed away. And for those who don't remember him, he became a sort of almost a hero at one point of our time.
Well, it was certainly the height of controversy. October 2004. He basically he shot a man at his farm in County Mayo. It's a quite a rural area. It's not too far from Cong. I remember being there with a photographer, and it was hard to find. And it would be an area where a lot of elderly people, and he's 81 now, so he would have been in his early 60s, and a lot of people were frightened living alone. There was a lot of break-ins and thefts from outhouses and stuff like that on farms. And even this particular area, even I think 10 years before, there was another case. 2 elderly brothers died after their house was burgled. So in this particular area, it was a real issue.
Yeah.
And we know from the trial, one of the trials subsequently, there was he was really living on his nerves. He was kind of sitting in the barn watching his back door, worried that that he could worried that somebody was going to come because he'd already lost tools from his shed. So he was sitting there, and then on the basis that if somebody kind of came in to try and break the back door, he'd have the drop on them. He'd be able to surprise the people. But it seemed like he was unraveling at this stage. And on this particular day in October in 2004. He shot Frog Ward, who'd come to his house. I think he'd started to try and wrestle with him or hit him with a stick. And there was a famous line in one of the cases said it was like beating a badger, and Frog Ward was shot in the leg. That we would talk a bit about who Frog Ward was as well. But he managed to stagger out onto the laneway, in front of the house. And as he was going up, he Nally shot him again in the back. Now, the facts were never disputed in either case.
No.
And that was the real controversial bit of it, wasn't it, from memory?
It was. And I suppose you can argue to make things worse, then he picked up the body. There was a kind of a low wall, but it was built on boggy land, so there's quite a drop on the other side. I remember looking over at it for some reason. And he pushed the body over this kind of low stone wall and to put the body down because he was worried that other people would see it, other people connected with Ward, and suddenly they'd all attack him. So he was still in this complete state of paranoia. And I think this is all came as part of his defence. Like there was 2 trials over it.
Yeah.
It was quashed on the first time.
So Frog Ward was a father of 11. Why was he there?
Well, Frog Ward was somebody who had a lot of convictions. I think it was 80 criminal convictions. And even at the time he was shot dead, he was due to face trial for allegedly attacking a guard. He had convictions for burglary, larceny, assault. So he was a well-known criminal. And obviously burglary was one of the ways in which he operated. So the case became one of those culture wars, I suppose, to an extent. You had a lot of, generally, I suppose even the majority of people had the sort of a support for Padraig Nally, saying that maybe in a country like in the US, if somebody invades your land, you've a right to self-defense. That's all he was doing. He'd been tormented. He'd been broken into at least twice in the run-up to this shooting incident, and that he had a right to defend his home from this man. There was another side as well who said that it was excessive force, and that because Frogward was a traveller, that there was an anti-traveller bias played into the case. That all became this kind of never solved debate, I suppose.
And the fact that he was shot in the back as he was walking away was one of the big controversies as well, that he wasn't shot in self-defence or couldn't have been, given that he was shot in the back.
And then other things played into it, this sense of rural crime, and that maybe people in the establishment in Dublin not understanding the realities of living in rural Ireland and the effects rural crime had on it. So there was all these debates went on to it. In the middle of it was Padraig Nally, who was, anything but an attention seeker. I actually called into.
So was he a bachelor farmer? Was he?
He did. I think his sister lived nearby, or might have been living there up until recently enough.
Yeah.
I think, before this incident. But I think I was there as well. And he didn't want to. He never really gave an interview. Didn't really want to talk. Certainly not to me, and obviously not.
Not to me. No,
either.
He wasn't impolite now or anything like it. But he wasn't one of these guys who embraced the moment, the Enoch Burke type of cultural controversy. Like, he just wasn't like that. So there was a lot of, I think, sympathy for him, because it wasn't somebody trying to, make some sort of political stand and then run for election.
Yeah, I mean, it was hugely emotive. I mean, and as you say, there was the idea that, he shot somebody in cold blood when he wasn't immediately in danger. That was kind of, I suppose, the reason for taking, the case against him. And that's, because he was no longer, like, strictly speaking, on his property. It was like, it was going beyond the kind of the use of necessary force. And I think the law was changed since, there's a kind of a higher or a different bar of proof now in regards to that. But I mean, I think Judge Carney said something like it was one of the most socially divisive cases. I mean, there really was a heightened state of emotion at the time. And it was because, I suppose, Frogward being a traveller, but also being a
violent criminal.
Also being a violent criminal with a huge number, with dozens and dozens of convictions, and who was... and he had crimes of violence as well, and he had psychiatric issues, and, he was a drink and drug user.
Was there explanations why he was there that day? I mean, it might be obvious, but
that it was a burglary.
It was a burglary.
I mean, at the time when he was killed, he was facing charges of attacking a Garda with a slash hook. And all of this evidence started to come out about it wasn't just a history of burglary. There was violence associated with it. He was also accompanied by Tom Ward, who was
yeah, his son was with him at the time, and I think the excuse was that they had horses in the area and they would have been feeding them, and I think there was no evidence that there were any horses.
Yeah. Right, okay.
So, I mean, I don't think that it wasn't a mystery what Frogward was doing there.
So Nally was acquitted, first of all, by the Central Criminal Court. And
was he not convicted initially?
No, he was convicted of manslaughter and given 6 years, and then that was appealed. That was successfully quashed, and then he was tried again. And he was found not guilty of manslaughter the second time around.
And he went back home at that point.
Yeah, he had served about 18 months in prison. And I think, I don't know, we can't really get into the mind of the jury, but he was acquitted of manslaughter the second time round.
And went home and said he often prayed for Ward, and he has lived there ever since until
he's lived there ever since.
So passed away.
I suppose the final outcome of it was a change in the law. In 2009, the government announced they plan to introduce a law of self-defence effectively after being recommended to do so by the Law Reform Commission. And it would codify, I'll read it out, the existing common law position on the use of force in defence of property. The criminal law Defence and Dwelling Act 2011 was enacted then. So that kind of gives a defence of allowing homeowners to exercise reasonable force in defending their home. Before, that didn't exist. Obviously, what is reasonable force has come up again and again ever since. Reasonable force is not obviously judged to be, you can do whatever you want if you find somebody on your property. And that's always a bone of contention, that the courts have to test in each individual case. So there was a legacy of it. And what happened was, as this state bill was proposed, as this bill was enacted, as, somebody was convicted under it or somebody was acquitted under it, people were calling to Padraig Nally. I actually had his phone number myself. He just had a regular phone, landline, and you might get him or might not.
Yeah.
And he might say one or two words.
Yeah. But not really. That's what I wanted to ask you, because there's a quote from him here actually after he did go home after being acquitted of manslaughter. And he talked about, he expressed sympathy actually to John Ward and to his widow Marie and the 11 children, and said, recognised that they were without a father, the 11 children, and how big a loss it was to them. But he says that he could see that after, because of the publicity about the incident, he was now a celebrity.
Yeah.
But he wanted to live that down. I think that meant that he just wanted to continue without that. He said, I know I'm known all over Ireland. I got thousands of letters and many cards and mass requests while I was in prison. Even while I was in Dublin, people came up to me on the street wanting to shake my hand. And after that acquittal, he went back to farming and was a regular at the Mam Cross Mart. So he never ever spoke, never talked about it.
No, I mean, if people grabbed him just because of the nature of who he was, sort of nice man, he'd say, I'll give you a couple of lines, but never wanted to sit down or do big interviews or, become a spokesperson for any political position. But obviously,
right up to his death now. I mean, headline news. On every station in the country.
It's funny. I suppose it shows how criminal cases can have such a wide effect. Some of the time. It's kind of, some of it was a different time as well. I think rural crime became a huge issue. I think because there was it hadn't existed. I suppose if this is what 2004, was it 2003?
Well, we were getting into the height of the Subaru gang and this crowd of based in West Tala that we've often talked about. But I think in this case, the fact that Frog Ward was a traveller was kind of used by people to kind of confirm their prejudice.
Yeah.
And I think it left the travelling community feeling, quite isolated and more marginalised than it normally would have been. And I don't think there was ever. I think Padraig Nally would have shot whoever was at his back door that day, and it was nothing to do with whether or not
there was definitely fear built up at that stage. It was the late 90s when Eddie Fitzmaurice had been killed.
Yeah.
Was that in Mayo?
Yeah. Well, Charlestown, it'd be close. It'd be relatively close by as well. It's kind of Mayo Sligo border.
And he was an elderly man with a kind of a store, hadn't he?
He was tied to banisters of a stair, and he was left in the freezing house. I think the windows were open or broken or something like that, and he basically died in that position. While they had ransacked his house, and it's an unsolved killing, that one. There's often appeals for information. I think they're pretty much have a suspect for that, and they're hoping someone at some point will feel some pang of guilt.
Yeah,
and come forward.
It kind of came out of that sort of fear of rural crime. I mean, it came from a position at some point where there was almost none, I think, in rural Ireland, and that
there was if you remember as well, there was two elderly brothers living in Eden Derry, and one of them was killed as well, and that was I think it was two fairly seriously drug addicted people based in Dublin that broke in and were trying to rob them, and that was all in the same. It was all in the same kind of time frame, and it was, it really did heighten the sort of emotion.
And there was this sense that, in rural Ireland, there was still what you describe as that time when there wasn't much crime, and people kept their money under the mattresses, didn't they? And all of a sudden, that money under the mattresses, which they did keep under the mattresses, they didn't trust banks or have them or whatever. And that was what was being targeted by these mobile crime gangs that you have written so much about, by those gangs that were coming out and using the motorway system and becoming ever more vicious.
Yeah. Just had a quick look there. So that would have been Paddy Logan, who was 81 in 2000.
Yeah.
And he basically died from a heart attack after, a pretty savage beating. They were trying to get where's the money? They kind of information out of him. So
I remember covering all those cases. They're very
4 years before.
Clear in my memory. Those two brothers lived in a little sort of cottage, and they had a radio wireless, they called it, and they used to put it on a Sunday to listen to the match, and that was their life. They had a very simple kind of a life, the two brothers, and then it was so sad because one of them had survived and the other, they had lived together all their lives.
Yeah.
And
So I mean, I think it was Paddy died and Peter survived, and he spoke, I think, to me at the time. He cut a kind of a. He cut a striking figure. Like his face was badly bloodied. Pictures were carried in all the media at the time. So that certainly would have fed into, I guess, the likes of Padraig Nally's paranoia, which there was something to it. That people were being targeted, and there definitely was at that time in that part of Mayo. There had been a number of thefts, and there had been neighbours like 10 years previously of Padraig Nally who had been raided and never really returned to their normal selves and died shortly afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, of course, the nature of rural crime that's 20 years ago has changed totally. The idea that the level of drug crime, for example, would be in those parts of rural Ireland at that stage wouldn't have been there. And of course now it's just absolutely routine that drugs and drug crime are in every single corner of Ireland. So I mean, yeah, it's crime continues to change, but there are some of those stories that really have an impact and ultimately, like in this case, lead to legislative change one way or another.
Anyway, no doubt Padraig Nally's funeral will be coming up this week, and we would send our sympathies to his family. So thank you.
Thanks, Nicola.
Cheers, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.